My name is John. I am 38 years old, and I have worked as a security guard in various places for more than a decade. Now I supervise a surveillance team in a shopping center in Los Angeles. It is a job that has given me some stability. Although I have seen dangerous situations, my training has prepared me to deal with them. However, what I experienced recently left me with a feeling that I still cannot shake. As if for the first time in a long time, I had faced something much darker than my training. It all started one afternoon. It was Friday, and the shopping center was full of people as always on those days. Families shopping, teenagers walking, and employees in their routines. Everything was going on normally. My shift ended at 9 at night, but in this job, the clock is never exact. Something always comes up last minute. A lost customer, a misunderstanding in the stores, or simply making sure that everything is in order. That night, I had left a little later than usual. It was around 9:30 when I finally said goodbye to my colleagues and walked toward the exit of the mall. The parking lot was almost empty, with only a few cars scattered here and there. I don't have a car, so my daily routine includes taking a taxi home. The streets of Los Angeles can be dangerous at night, but I have always been careful. I don't take random taxis. I prefer to use transportation applications that seem safer to me. However, that night something didn't fit from the beginning. While I was walking toward the area where I normally wait for my transportation, a yellow taxi stopped on the side of the curb. The driver was a middle-aged man with a cap that barely let his face be seen. He rolled down the window and called me, "Taxi boss?" he asked with a neutral smile. Normally, I would have rejected the offer and waited for my vehicle from the app. But that night I was tired and the taxi looked quite normal. There were visible license plates, and the driver seemed like a common man. Although something in my instinct told me not to do it, I decided to ignore him. After all, I had been living in this city for years and had learned to trust my common sense. "Okay, I'm going to Sunset Boulevard," I told him as I got into the back seat, closing the door behind me. The taxi driver nodded and started driving. At first, everything seemed in order. The car radio was on with a soft music station. The air conditioning was working well, and the city traffic had slowed down enough that the trip was quiet. However, a few minutes after leaving the shopping center, something began to feel bad. I noticed that the taxi driver did not take the usual route to my neighborhood. Instead of continuing along the main avenue, he turned into a darker side street, one of those narrow, poorly lit streets that I never used. At first, I thought maybe he was trying to avoid traffic, or maybe he knew of some detour. But as we moved forward, the uncomfortable feeling in my stomach grew. "Hey, boss, this is not the fastest way," I told him, trying to sound casual. The driver did not respond immediately. His hands were clinging to the steering wheel, and his face was mostly hidden by the shadow of his cap. The silence inside the taxi became suffocating. "I'm taking an alternate route. There's a lot of traffic on the main road," he finally answered, but something in his tone made me feel that it wasn't true. I looked out the window. We were in an area that I did not recognize, deserted streets and buildings that seemed abandoned. My breathing accelerated. I knew something was wrong. "I think I prefer to go the usual way," I told him, trying to stay calm. "I'm not in a hurry." The taxi driver didn't respond this time. Instead of stopping or correcting course, he accelerated slightly, as if he were determined to continue along that route. At that moment, my heart began to beat faster, and my safety instinct was activated. I remembered the stories I had heard about kidnapping taxi drivers in the city, and an intense cold ran through my spine. "Stop here," I ordered him firmly. "I'm going to get out." The driver still didn't respond. My hands started to sweat, and I looked around the taxi, looking for some way to get out, but the back doors were locked. I tried to open the door manually, but it wouldn't move. The clicking sound of the car's locks resonated in the silence, confirming what I already feared. I was trapped in that taxi. "What are you doing?" I demanded. "Stop right now." The man didn't say anything. Instead, he pressed the accelerator, and the car began to move even faster through the dark streets of the city. The music from the radio continued to play in the background like a grotesque melody that contrasted with the panic I was beginning to feel. My mind began to race, looking for a way out. I tried to stay calm, remembering my training as a security guard. I knew I had to act quickly. My first thought was to call the police, but when I took out my cell phone, the driver turned sharply, causing the phone to slip out of my hands and fall to the floor of the taxi. I leaned over to pick it up, but the movement of the car made it difficult for me to reach it. "Stop!" I shouted now, with a voice full of desperation. The driver turned his head slightly, and for the first time I saw his eyes cold, calculating, as if he was used to situations like this. It was not the first time he had done something like this, and I knew it. I finally managed to get my cell phone back, and with trembling hands, I dialed the emergency number. But before I could press call, the cab made another sharp turn, and the phone slipped out of my hands again, this time getting trapped between the seat and the door. Panic began to take over me, but I couldn't give up. I knew that if I didn't act quickly, things could end badly. My mind remembered something that I always carry with me. A small utility knife that I keep on my belt, a personal safety measure during my years in this job. It's not a big deal, but in a dangerous situation, any tool can be crucial. With my heart beating at a mile a minute, I came up with a plan. I knew I had to do something. When I turned again into another dark alley, I decided to act. "I told you to stop," I screamed, and with all my might, I slammed the knife against the door lock. I tried hard, hoping to break the mechanism or at least free it, and after a few seconds of tension, I heard a click. The lock jumped, and the door unlocked. The driver realized what I was doing and turned the car violently to try to destabilize it. I almost lost my balance, but I managed to hold on to the edge of the door. The car was still moving, but I was determined not to stay inside. With one last effort, I pushed the door open and jumped out of the moving taxi. I fell rolling on the asphalt, feeling the blow in every part of my body, but I was outside. The car accelerated even more, and I saw how the driver disappeared into the darkness, leaving a cloud of dust and fear behind. I was left lying on the street, bruised and sore but alive. I stayed there for a few seconds, trying to process what I had just experienced. The silence of the night enveloped me, and for a moment, I felt like the world had stopped. But the pain in my arms and legs brought me back to reality. I was safe, but as soon as I got up slowly, I limped towards the sidewalk. My cell phone was still in the taxi, but it didn't matter anymore. The important thing was that I had managed to escape. My thoughts were clouded as I tried to find my way to a safe place. I knew I had to call the police, but first, I needed to calm down and understand what had just happened. I walked through the deserted streets until I found a convenience store. I went in with my body full of scrapes and my mind full of fear. The manager looked at me strangely, but I didn't pay attention. I asked to use the phone and finally called the authorities. That night, while I was giving my statement at the police station, I understood something terrifying. I wasn't the only one. The officers told me about a series of similar incidents that had been happening in the city. Taxi drivers who kidnapped passengers, taking them to dark places to rob them or, worse yet, to disappear them. I was lucky to have gotten out of that situation alive, but since then, my perception of safety changed forever. Every time I leave work and have to take a taxi or ask for transportation, I feel a knot in my stomach, a shadow of what I experienced that night. And even though I try to move forward, knowing that I was one of the few who managed to escape, I can't help but think of others, those who did not have the same luck. If you are enjoying the stories, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. My name is Brian, and I have worked as a civil engineer in San Francisco for more than 15 years. My days are usually long and exhausting, filled with meetings, project supervision, and visits to construction sites in different parts of the city. Traffic, travel times, and the constant pressure of work often make the days endless, which is why, like many in this city, I have come to depend on taxis and transportation applications to move quickly. I have a car, and although I am very careful with taxis, a recent experience showed me how fragile the sense of security one has when getting into a stranger's car can be. It was a Monday night around 10:30 when I found myself waiting for a taxi outside a meeting in the Marina District. It had been an especially long day. We had been reviewing the project at work since the morning, and then I had to attend a meeting with some clients until late. Fatigue invaded me, and the only thing I wanted was to get home, take a hot shower, and go to bed. I checked my transportation app, but the prices were through the roof due to high demand at that time. I didn't feel like waiting or paying more, so I decided that for once, I could take a traditional taxi off the street. I saw a taxi that was a white car with blue stripes slowly approaching along the avenue, one of those old models that still circulate in the city. The driver, a middle-aged man with a thin beard and a short-brimmed hat, waved at me as if he knew me. "Where are you going, young man?" he asked with a smile that did not reach his eyes. I responded that I was heading to the Sunset District, showing him the exact address. "Get in. I'll take you quickly," he said, and although I hesitated for a second, I was so tired that I decided not to think about it too much. I got into the back seat, and the car started with a small noise. At first, everything seemed normal, the typical San Francisco taxi, the noise of the engine, the sounds of the traffic still in the streets, and the music coming from the radio. The man seemed friendly, although not too talkative, which was a relief because I wasn't in the mood for small talk. I just wanted to get home. However, as the minutes passed, something started to feel strange. The driver didn't seem to follow the usual route I took to go home from the Marina District. Instead of continuing along the main avenue, he turned down secondary streets and then another one, further and further away from the main avenues and deeper into less illuminated neighborhoods. At first, I thought he was trying to avoid the traffic, but something didn't add up. The streets we were going on weren't routes that I recognized. It wasn't the first time I took a taxi from that area, and I knew more or less which roads were the fastest. The one he was taking wasn't. "It's faster here?" I asked, trying to sound casual. Although discomfort was beginning to take over me, the man looked at me briefly in the rearview mirror with a strange smile on his face. "Don't worry, young man. I know all the shortcuts in the city," he responded without offering any further explanation. My instinct began to alert me. That tone made me worried, and that smile did not inspire confidence in me. I decided not to confront him directly, but I began to be more alert. I took out my cell phone and discreetly opened the map application to see where we were going. My worst fear was confirmed. We were going in the opposite direction to my house. Instead of heading towards Sunset, we were deep in an area that I did not recognize well. A narrow, industrial zone where the streets were deserted and there was hardly any light on the corners. "Hey, I don't think this is the right road," I said this time more firmly. The driver didn't respond immediately. Instead, he accelerated slightly, just enough for the car to pick up more speed than I would have liked on those narrow streets. My heart started racing. It was clear that something was not right. I leaned forward a little, trying to stay calm, but it was already clear to me that I had to get out of that taxi as soon as possible. "Stop here," I told him, trying to sound authoritative. "I'd rather get off." The man smiled again, showing his teeth, but he didn't slow down. "We're almost there," he said, as if he knew something that I didn't. My mind raced. I had to do something. I quickly checked the back doors, but the locks were on, and there was no way to open them from the inside. I knew that in some old taxis, the drivers modify the doors so that they cannot be opened from the inside, a tactic used by thieves or people who want to kidnap their passengers. I felt a wave of panic run through my body. I was not sure what intentions this man had, but one thing was clear. He was not going to take me home. My mind remembered the stories I had heard that circulated on social media and the news about taxis that kidnapped people to assault them, or worse yet, for much darker purposes. I never thought I would find myself in a situation like this, but now it was real, and I was in it. With trembling hands, I surreptitiously tried to open the emergency application on my cell phone, but the driver noticed it. "Don't use the phone," he said with a coldness that made my blood run cold. "You don't want to make this more difficult, right?" My heart started to pound in my chest. There was no longer any doubt. I was in danger, but I couldn't let fear paralyze me. I knew I had to act quickly if I wanted to get out of there. With my eyes fixed on the rearview mirror, trying not to show panic, I started to think of a way to escape. "I just want to get out of there," I said, trying to calm my voice and sound as neutral as possible. "I don't feel well." The man didn't respond, but his hands were gripping the steering wheel tightly, and I noticed that he was starting to look for something in the front glove compartment with one hand. Panic invaded me completely. I didn't know what he was looking for, but nothing good could happen. At that moment, the only thing I could think about was how to get out of the car. I remembered that in some taxis, although the rear door locks were locked, the windows could still be lowered manually. I decided to try my luck. "Please stop here," I insisted, trying to distract him while my left hand surreptitiously began to turn the window handle. Much to my relief, the window began to roll down slowly. The driver didn't seem to realize what I was doing, still focused on whatever he was looking for in the glove box. When the window was low enough, I saw my chance. The car slowed down into a corner, and without thinking twice, I propelled myself towards the window and jumped out of the moving car. It wasn't a clean jump. I felt my knees hit the pavement hard. I rolled a couple of times, feeling the pain in my body as I hit the ground, but I was outside. The taxi continued to advance a few meters before stopping abruptly. I could see how the driver got out of the car and shouted something, but I didn't stay to listen. I limped as best I could and ran in the opposite direction without looking back. My heart was beating so hard that I could barely hear my own footsteps. I didn't know exactly where I was, but I saw a convenience store in the distance, a light that shone like a beacon in the middle of the darkness. I ran toward it, gasping with pain spreading throughout my body, but fear gave me the strength not to stop. When I got to the store, I collapsed on the floor next to the entrance, breathing hard. The manager came out immediately, worried, and I asked for help. With trembling hands, I dialed the emergency number on his phone and, in a whisper, explained what had happened. They arrived a few minutes later, although to me it felt like hours. I gave them the description of the taxi and the driver, but in a city as big as this, I knew that finding him would be difficult. The important thing was that I had managed to escape, although I couldn't stop thinking about what could have happened if I had not acted that night. As I sat on the edge of the sidewalk catching my breath, I realized how close I had come to ending that night in a much worse way. Since then, my perspective on getting into a taxi in this city changed. I no longer see each passenger as a simple source of income, and I am always alert, attentive to the signs that may indicate that something is not right. Being a taxi driver in San Francisco has always been a complicated job, but after that night, I know that you can never be too careful. My name is Paul, and I have been a taxi driver in Chicago for more than 20 years. Like anyone who has worked in this city, I know how to drive a taxi. Here it is not just a matter of knowing the streets well. You have to have patience, instinct, and a good dose of luck to avoid the problems that sooner or later are going to come your way. I have taken all types of passengers, from stressed executives to lost tourists, and even dating couples in the middle of an argument. But without a doubt, the most complicated are usually the drunks. Driving someone who is out of control due to alcohol can be a difficult task. But what happened to me a few months ago surpassed everything I had experienced until then. On a Friday night, it was almost midnight, and I had been driving for more than 10 hours. Fridays are always busy days. People leave work, go to parties, or have dinner with friends. When they can't drive anymore or don't feel like walking, they call a taxi. The traffic in the areas near bars and restaurants is hellish, but for taxi drivers, those nights are usually the most profitable. So despite the fatigue, I decided to continue driving for a couple more hours, hoping to pick up one or two more passengers before returning home. I was in the Wicker Park area, one of the busiest spots due to the city's nightlife. The bars and restaurants were full, and the streets were bustling with young people looking for fun. While I was slowly driving down an avenue, waiting for someone to call me, I saw in the distance a man making desperate signs, standing on the street corner. He was staggering a little, with his shirt badly buttoned and his face red. There was no doubt that he was drunk. At first, I hesitated to stop. Dealing with a drunk passenger was not what I felt like most at that moment. But I also knew that it was part of the job and that on many occasions, drunks just wanted to get home and didn't cause much trouble. So I decided to stop next to him. "Taxi, boss," I asked, rolling down the window. The man staggered towards the car, almost tripping over the curb. He looked to be in his 40s, with disheveled hair and the typical expression of someone who has drunk too much. His breath of alcohol was unmistakable, and his eyes could barely focus on me. Yes, taxi. Please take me to Lincoln Park," he stammered with a clumsy tongue. I nodded, trying to hide my discomfort, and I opened the back door for him to get in. I saw him struggle to have balance while he got into the car, and when he finally managed to get comfortable, he sighed heavily, as if the simple act of sitting had exhausted him. I started the taxi and drove down the avenue. Lincoln Park was not too far away, but with the traffic at night, I estimated that the trip would take about 20 minutes. I tried to concentrate on the road, but I couldn't ignore the noises coming from the back seat. The man was muttering unintelligible things. He was talking to himself, and from time to time, he would let out a nervous laugh. At times it seemed like he fell asleep, but then he would start babbling something incoherent again. "Friend," he said suddenly, leaning forward enough so that I could smell the alcohol on his breath. "Do you know what happened to me today? It was horrible." "Oh yes," I answered without taking my eyes off the road. "What happened to you?" It wasn't that I was really interested in his story, but after so many years of experience, I knew that sometimes simply listening to a drunk passenger could avoid problems. If you kept them talking, they relaxed, and the trip was calmer. "My wife left me today," he continued, his tongue tangled. "She left with another guy. Imagine. After so many years, so many sacrifices, and she leaves with another one." He hit the seat with his fist, although without much force, and then leaned back, letting out a sigh. I sighed internally. I had heard many stories like that. Spite, betrayal, relationship problems. It wasn't the first time someone had vented to me while drunk. "That sounds difficult," I said, trying to sound empathetic. although my mind was already thinking about how quickly I wanted to end that trip. But I'm sure things will get better.
No.
You don't understand, he shouted suddenly, hitting the seat harder this time. It's just that she left me with nothing. I know she took everything from my house, my money, my car, everything. His voice broke, and for a moment I thought he was going to start crying. The atmosphere in the taxi became heavier. I tried to stay calm as I turned a corner, waiting for him to calm down. But instead, his sadness turned into a kind of deranged euphoria. But it doesn't matter anymore, he shouted, laughing for no apparent reason. You know why? Because I showed everyone who's boss. That's what I did today. My heart began to beat faster. The way he said it, the tone of his voice, everything indicated that he was talking about something serious. What kind of surprise? I asked, feeling a shiver run down my spine. The man looked at me in the rearview mirror, and his smile widened. Something they will never forget, he murmured. You know, today I stopped by the office after having a few drinks. They didn't let me in, of course. The damn guards kicked me out. But that didn't stop me. No, I didn't go in through the back. I broke a window and left something for them. Something that will explode when they least expect it. My hands began to sweat on the steering wheel. What the hell was this guy talking about? Maybe he had left a bomb or something. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. But his expression and the way he spoke were serious enough to be more than just a drunken hallucination. I tried to think quickly. I couldn't just leave him to his fate knowing what he had just told me. If what he was saying was true, someone could be in danger. But I couldn't confront him directly either. Not in his state, he was unpredictable, and I didn't know what he was capable of. I decided that the best thing would be to try to get more information out of him while I thought about what to do. That sounds intense, I said in the calmest voice I could muster. And what exactly did you leave behind? The man laughed out loud. You'll never know that, my friend, he said, pointing at me with his index finger while wobbling in the seat. I'll just tell you that when it happens. Oh wow, everyone will know. My mind was racing a mile an hour. I knew I had to do something, but I didn't want to provoke him directly. So I made a decision to stray slightly from the path and stop at a gas station, pretending that I needed to fill up with fuel. Hey, do you think I can make a quick stop at the gas station? I asked, trying to sound carefree. Whatever you want, friend, whatever you want, the man responded, laughing once again and leaning back in the seat. I drove to the nearest gas station, trying not to show how nervous I was. As I approached the gas pump, I saw a police officer patrolling near the entrance. That was my chance. I stopped the car next to the pump, turned off the engine, and quickly got out. Just a moment, I told the man. I was going to get gas. The man didn't seem bothered. He was too drunk to realize what was happening. I approached the policeman with quick and discreet steps, trying not to attract the attention of the drunk in the car. I need help, I whispered urgently. My passenger is drunk and just confessed that he left something dangerous in his office. I don't know if he's joking or not, but I'm worried it might be true. The policeman looked at me with surprise at first, but then he nodded, understanding the seriousness of the situation. He immediately called on the radio to his companions and asked me to return to the car while he approached cautiously. I returned to the taxi and sat in the driver's seat, trying to act normally. The drunk did not seem to have noticed anything. He continued talking, laughing from time to time, and mumbling about what he had done in the office. A few minutes later, 2 patrol cars arrived at the gas station. The police officers discreetly approached the car, and one of them leaned toward the passenger window. "Good evening, sir," the officer said in a firm voice. "Could you come with us for a moment?" The man raised his head in confusion, but before he could react, The police took him out of the car carefully. The man tried to resist at first, but he was too drunk to put up much resistance. They handcuffed him and took him to the patrol car while I sat in the taxi, feeling how the tension in my body began to dissipate. They passed a few minutes before the officer came back and explained the situation to me. Turns out that after taking the man to the station, they investigated more about his story. In the end, it turned out that he had destroyed some things in the office but had not left any bombs. It had all been an exaggeration of his drunken mind. However, the authorities detained him for the damage caused and for reckless driving in his condition that night. While driving back home, I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. I realized that although it had just been a delusional story from a drunk man, the fear and uncertainty were real. Sometimes, drunk customers are more than just nuisances. They can be dangerous to themselves and others. Since then, I have learned to be much more cautious with the passengers I pick up, especially those who are not of sound mind. You never know when one night, a calm situation can turn into an out-of-control event. My name is Mark, and I am a firefighter in New York City. I have been working in this job for more than 20 years, and although I could say that I have become accustomed to emergencies, sirens, and tragedies, there are things that never go away from your mind. I have been in all kinds of situations, impossible rescues, horrible accidents, and, of course, fires that seemed unstoppable. But there is one in particular, one that happened recently in an old house. It was the end of September, a cold and silent night. The city had spent a fairly quiet day at the station. My colleagues and I were having dinner, and most of us were already getting ready to sleep for a while when suddenly the alarm sounded. Whenever we hear that alarm, our heart beats hard. Even after so many years, you know that something is wrong, but you don't know what awaits you until we get into the truck. While we were leaving, they informed us by radio that it was a fire in an old house on the edge of the Bronx. They described it as an abandoned house, one of those that are on the outskirts and hardly anyone notices. I thought it would be one of those nights where the fire is due to homeless people sneaking in to light bonfires. I was already driving slowly along the Sierra Road, carefully navigating the weight of my load around every bend. I had about 20 miles left before reaching the most dangerous part, the curve of the Spectres. This section had developed a notorious reputation since the road was built years ago. A series of fatal accidents had painted the curve with blood. Locals insisted the road had a mind of its own and that, on foggy nights, the ghosts of those who had died there returned, trapped in an eternal loop, seeking to drag others with them. They were just legends, I told myself. It wasn't my first time using that curve in the dead of night, and although I had felt a chill on occasion, I had never seen anything unusual. I switched on the CB radio to report my location, hoping that some fellow trucker was nearby for a chat to stave off loneliness. The CB usually provided some companionship on night routes, but that time, instead of a friendly response, I heard a sound akin to an echo, a soft murmur emerging from the static. "Here you go, reporting from 10 miles before the curve." I fell silent. That voice was mine, but something about the tone made me hesitate. I hadn't said anything yet or even touched the CB microphone, and yet my voice resonated back, echoing strangely, as if it came from a distant place. My name is Mark, and I am a firefighter in New York City. I have been working in this job for more than 20 years, and although I could say that I have become accustomed to emergencies, sirens, and tragedies, there are things that never go away from your mind. I have been in all kinds of situations, impossible rescues, horrible accidents, and, of course, fires that seemed unstoppable. But there is one in particular, one that happened recently in an old house. It was the end of September, a cold and silent night. The city had spent a fairly quiet day at the station. My colleagues and I were having dinner, and most of us were already getting ready to sleep for a while when suddenly the alarm sounded. Whenever we hear that alarm, our heart beats hard. Even after so many years, You know that something is wrong, but you don't know what awaits you until we get into the truck. While we were leaving, they informed us by radio that it was a fire in an old house on the edge of the Bronx. They described it as an abandoned house, one of those that are on the outskirts and hardly anyone notices. I thought it would be one of those nights where the fire is due to homeless people sneaking in to light bonfires or something similar. But when we arrived at the scene, I knew I was wrong. The fire, focus, I told myself, it's just the fog. But the voice on the CB returned, louder now, more insistent. This is your last curve, Jake. Stop. My whole body trembled upon hearing those words as if something icy pierced my chest. I had never felt such immediate and intense fear. The voice was mine, but it spoke with a tone I'd never used, one that sounded desperate, pleading, as if begging me not to proceed. In that moment, I realized something that left me frozen. It wasn't just the CB. The very same voice was starting to echo in my head, repeating those words in my mind as if I were trapped in a nightmare. Stop, Jake, stop. I tried to push those thoughts away, focusing on the road ahead, but the fear had nested inside me. The curve was approaching, and the air in the cabin felt thicker, as if I were breathing underwater. I tried to roll up the window to keep the fog outside, but nothing seemed to ease the oppressive sensation. About 100 meters from the curve, I noticed something in the road. It was a figure, a shadow that seemed to move toward me, slow and steady, occupying the center of the lane. My first instinct was to hit the brakes, but the weight of the truck made any sudden movement potentially fatal. I inched closer, and the headlights illuminated the figure. It appeared to be a man, or at least that was what it looked like. He wore a dark jacket and a hat that obscured his face, and he stared intently at me. It can't be, I murmured as my heart felt like it might explode. Then the figure lifted his head, and I saw his face. It was me. My own pale face with empty eyes, as if looking through me. The figure raised his hand, pointing forward, as if warning me to stop before entering the curve. I slammed on the brakes, but the truck wouldn't respond. The load pushed me toward the curve as if I were being drawn by an invisible force. The figure looked at me with a look of terror on his face, and at that moment, the CB blared again, this time with a clarity that made me shudder. This is your last curve, Jake. Your last curve. I twisted the wheel, trying to maintain control, but the road seemed to resist me. I felt something pushing me, dragging me toward the edge. The figure vanished, and for a moment, I thought it had all been an illusion. But as I turned, I saw something that took my breath away. The curve seemed to distort in front of me, as if the road extended into an endless darkness. The truck's headlights illuminated an abyss that appeared to widen like a mouth ready to swallow me. And in that darkness, I saw shadows, figures moving slowly, watching me from the other side of the road. Suddenly, one of the shadows materialized, approaching me. It was another trucker, his face covered in grime and blood. He looked at me with hollow eyes as if trapped in an eternity of suffering. I tried to divert my gaze, but the CB echoed again in the cabin with a voice so low it was barely a whisper. We're trapped. There's no way back. My heart raced so intensely it almost hurt. Every fiber of my being wanted to escape that place, but the truck moved slowly, pulled by something unseen. I knew I should hit the brakes, turn around, but the road absorbed me as if there was no other option. Then, just as I was about to cross the curve, the CB emitted a final warning in a voice I barely recognized as my own. This is your last opportunity, Jake. Stop now. With all my strength, I pressed the brake pedal, and the truck screeched to a halt just before the edge of the curve. The cabin trembled, and I felt the engine sputter in one last effort. I looked through the windshield and saw the abyss, the darkness that seemed to stretch out before me, the shadows watching from a distance, motionless as if waiting for me to take another step. I took a deep breath, and without looking back, I turned off the truck. The fog began to lift, and the road gradually cleared. I had escaped, but something told me I wasn't alone. If you are enjoying the stories, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. It was past midnight, and the road wound before me like an endless ribbon of dark asphalt. There was something strange about this night. The air felt denser than usual, and the sky was covered in clouds blocking even the light from the moon. My name is Nick Morris, and I have been a truck driver for over 30 years, traversing all kinds of routes from well-paved highways to the most treacherous roads in the United States. Driving at night felt like entering a trance, a world where only I, the roar of my truck, and the soft murmur of the CB radio, left on by habit in case a fellow driver reported on the same route, existed. That night, I was hauling a load of heavy machinery parts. The weight of the truck and the stability of the cargo required all my concentration, so I decided to make no stops. My only plan was to drive straight through to the next service station, about 40 miles away. The road was utterly deserted. Not a soul in sight, and in the distance, I could barely make out the reflection of my headlights on the traffic signs. Suddenly, the CB radio emitted a faint crackle, barely a whisper mingling with static. I didn't think much of it. Interference was common in mountainous areas. But then something odd happened. Amid the static, I began to hear a voice that sounded barely perceptible, as if someone was speaking from far away. The voice was low, almost a murmur, but it seemed to carry a kind of authority, a familiarity that sent chills down my spine. Nick Morris," said the voice, and the sound of my own name resonated in the cabin. I stared at the CB, hoping it would give me some explanation. My first reaction was to think it was a prank by some colleague, although that idea didn't make much sense. Most truckers I knew were either retired or asleep by that hour, and the few who were still active wouldn't likely be on this isolated road. "Who's there?" I asked, gripping the CB microphone and trying to keep calm in my voice. But there was no response, only prolonged silence broken by the soft buzz of static. I decided to let it slide. The night was long, and hours on the road often play tricks on the mind. I tightened my grip on the steering wheel, trying to concentrate on the road. However, a couple of minutes later, the voice returned, this time much clearer, and what it said sent a deep chill to my core. "Nick, your mother's name is and, isn't it? And Morris loved to embroider flowers on the tablecloths she set when you were a child. You recall that scent of chamomile, don't you?" My breath caught in my throat. No one, absolutely no one besides my family, knew those details. My mother, and had passed away years ago, but as a child, I spent hours watching her embroider while she hummed old songs. I felt my hands begin to tremble. I gripped my teeth, trying to find a logical explanation. "Who are you? How do you know that?" I stammered into the CB, my voice shaking, but I tried to maintain control. The response was immediate, as if the voice had been waiting for my question. "Nick, don't worry. I know many things about you. I know you broke your left arm when you were 7 in that bicycle accident in front of the Johnson house. You remember running downhill and not seeing the pothole. It still hurts you when the weather changes, doesn't it?" My heart began to race so loudly I could hear it in my ears. That bicycle fall, the scar, and the ache in my arm that returned every winter were things I hadn't shared with anyone in years. I started to sweat cold, and my mind struggled to understand how someone on the radio could know such things. Without a second thought, I turned the dial on the radio, searching for another frequency, but the voice remained, no matter how many times I changed channels. It was as if I were trapped on a frequency I couldn't leave, one I couldn't abandon. The voice, though soft, grew more insistent, as if it knew I was getting anxious. "Nick, don't try to shut me off. You can't run away from me," said the voice, and this time it sounded almost amused, as if it thrived on the effect it was having on me. "Remember that night when you ran away from your grandfather's house? You were 11, and you swore you saw something move in the hallway. Of course, nobody believed you, but you know you saw something." I recalled that night clearly. It had been one of the most terrifying experiences of my childhood. I had run outside in sheer terror, convinced a strange shadow was lurking in the hallway, but everyone thought it was just my imagination. How was it possible that someone knew that? "What is this? Some sort of joke? Tell me who you are," I shouted into the CB, but deep down, I felt that this voice wasn't going to respond to me. Not in the way I desired. "It's no joke, Nick. I'm just here to keep you company tonight. After all, you've been alone on the road for so long, haven't you?" The tone of the voice was soft, almost soothing, yet each word deepened my fear. I couldn't see the person speaking, but I felt as if they were right behind me in some dark corner of the cabin. Then, as if to confirm my worst fears, the voice continued, mentioning something that completely froze me. "Do you remember that night 20 years ago when you took that wrong turn by mistake?" I certainly did. The man I saw on the road, the one who was hitchhiking, I had chosen to just drive past. I had never forgiven myself for not stopping that night. That particular night was etched in my memory like an open wound. It was true. Many years ago, on a rural road in New Mexico, I'd seen a man waving in the darkness. He was covered in dust and looked desperate. I ignored him under the pretense of avoiding trouble. The next day, I learned from a gas station that the man had died just hours after I passed. Of a heart attack, they said. Since then, the image haunted me, replaying in the back of my mind. "Nick," the voice whispered, and this time it felt like a whisper emanating from within, as if the sound originated from the shadows of the cabin itself. "That night, you weren't alone on the road. You never have been. There is always someone with you, even if you can't see them." The CB went completely silent. There was no more static or voices, just an oppressive, absolute silence. I remained frozen, unsure of what to do. The silence in the cabin was so dense that I felt each heartbeat echoing in the void. But then, suddenly, the voice returned, and this time it didn't come from the CB. It came from somewhere behind me. "Why don't you look at the passenger seat, Nick?" I didn't want to turn my head. My whole body refused to obey that command. I knew with an inexplicable certainty that something or someone was there, and if I looked, I would see something I couldn't bear. I gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white, forcing myself to concentrate on the road. Yet I felt the presence beside me, so close I could hear its breathing. "Come on, Nick. Don't you want to see who's talking to you?" The voice had a soft tone, as if it were enjoying my terror. With my heart racing and my stomach twisted in knots, I forced myself to glance at the passenger seat. At first, I saw nothing but shadows cast by the headlights. But as my eyes adjusted to the dimness, I noticed a vague, barely discernible figure that was nonetheless present. It resembled a blurry reflection, a shadow that shouldn't be there. Its eyes, though dull, were fixed on me. "Remember, Nick," said the figure, and its voice seemed to drag itself across time. "I have always been with you." I tightened my grip on the wheel, diverting my gaze back to the road. My hands trembled, and the cold I felt was so profound that not even the cabin's heating could alleviate it. The figure vanished as suddenly as it had appeared, and the CB returned to its soft, familiar static. I have no idea how long it took to reach the next service station, but as soon as I parked the truck, I rushed out and stood under the lights, breathing in the cool morning air. I had never felt such relief at leaving the cabin of my own truck. Since that night, although the CB remains in the truck, I have never turned it on again. The night had descended heavily on the road with unusual intensity. A storm was brewing, and the sky was cloaked in a blanket of black clouds that barely allowed the light from the lightning crackling on the horizon to pass through. My name is Jack Monroe, and I have been driving throughout the United States for nearly 35 years, crossing states and dirt roads, enduring long and short journeys, navigating narrow highways and winding roads. That night, I had to drive a dangerous route to Arizona carrying a load of lumber for a construction company. I knew the storm would catch up to me at some point during the trip, but I had no choice. The job was the job, and the client expected their delivery at dawn. As I drove, I noticed the sky darkening even further, and the air becoming thick, as if it were a warning of what was to come. Around 10 p.m., the storm finally hit me. The rain started as a light drizzle, but soon turned into a wall of water that made it hard to see just a few meters ahead. I turned on the windshield wipers at full speed, but even then, the road blurred into darkness. The raindrops sounded like drumming on the cabin roof, and the wind battered the truck, making each turn more perilous. In that stretch of road, there were no lights or stations, nothing that offered a sense of security. Just me, my truck, and the fury of the storm roaring around me. The CB radio, which I always kept on, was merely static due to the bad weather. The lightning interfered with the signal, and occasionally, I heard crackling noises and strange sounds as if the storm itself were invading the channel. After several minutes of battling through near-zero visibility, I resigned myself to the idea of having to cross that part without any assistance from the radio or any company. However, just as I was about to turn off the CB to reduce the noise, an unusual sound caught my attention. It was a series of rhythmic beeps interspersed with brief and long pauses, something I had never heard before on a CB frequency. The message repeated over and over in the same rhythmic tone, like a plea frozen in time. The voice transmitting the message, if it could be called a voice, sounded inhuman, metallic, as if it were coming from another world. A chill ran down my back, and the truck began to veer off course. I hurried to regain control of the steering wheel, focusing on the road while trying to grasp what was happening. As I advanced, the beeping of the Morse code grew louder. The message repeated again and again, always the same pattern, SOS. A pause, and then words in a Morse code that became increasingly clear, SOS, air route, requesting assistance. The signal was strong and increasingly insistent, air route. Those words baffled me. How could someone on the radio be talking about an air route in the middle of a road? I pressed the microphone, determined to respond, even though it felt ridiculous. Is anyone there? This is Jack Monroe, truck driver en route to Arizona. I repeat, who is transmitting? I asked, my voice trembling slightly. I didn't know who I was speaking to or if anyone would hear my reply, but something inside compelled me to continue. For a few seconds, there was nothing but static. I thought the transmission had ceased. But then the voice returned, this time not in Morse code but in a kind of broken and archaic English. Here, Flight Alpha 11. We request emergency assistance. The voice crackled and the sound was irregular, as if it had passed through an old or broken filter. Flight Alpha 11, we are in trouble, we're losing altitude. Seek fog. Coordinates. Each word struck my mind like thunder. There was something chilling in the voice. It sounded like it came from a distant place, like an echo trapped in time. I knew that no plane currently would be designated as 11. That kind of designation was very old, probably from the 1950s or 60s. As the voice spoke, I recalled a long-forgotten story I'd heard at a nearby gas station years ago. A story I had almost forgotten. They said that in that area of the Rockies many years ago, a plane had disappeared during a storm like this one. The locals claimed that a small commercial flight never reached its destination and that they never found the wreckage or any passengers. It was a mystery that had gone unresolved, and on the rare occasions when someone mentioned it, they did so as a scary tale, a local legend. The transmission continued. "We are losing altitude. Fire in the engine." The voice broke, and a sound that resembled a stifled scream resonated through the radio. "We request assistance. If anyone can hear us, please respond." I grasped the microphone again, not knowing what to say. "This is Jack Monroe on the road. Can you hear me?" I repeat, "Can you hear me?" There was no response, only the noise of static filling the CB. But then the voice returned, this time weaker, as if it were fading away. "Fire! Smoke! We can't see anything." There was a silence, and then I heard something I would never forget. A series of desperate screams. Voices of men and women who seemed to be pleading for help, followed by the sound of an impact. A deafening noise that echoed throughout the cabin. The CB fell silent. The storm roared louder, and the road became increasingly slippery. I felt the cold sweat run down my forehead. The radio had gone completely silent, and only the drumming of the rain on the truck's roof and the sound of thunder echoed in the distance could be heard. I wasn't sure if I had imagined all that, but the fear was real. Instinctively, I made a decision and took a secondary exit, searching for a place to stop and process what I had just heard. I found a small clearing beside the road and halted the truck. I turned off the engine and, for a moment, I sat in silence, listening to the storm. Just when I thought it had all ended, the CB flickered back to life, this time with a voice clear as a whisper. "Jack, can you still hear us? We are still here." Terror paralyzed me. I hadn't touched the CB or switched it back on, but the voice was there, as if it were a whisper caught in the wind. I glanced through the windshield, and through the rain and mist, I could see a blurry figure that seemed to move along the road. It was like a shadow, a silhouette of someone standing in the storm, staring at me. The voice came back, soft yet persistent. "Help us, Jack. We don't want to be here." I closed my eyes, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination. But the CB emitted one last message, a whisper that resonated throughout the cabin, sounding like an echo of a multitude. "We are trapped, Jack, trapped in the fog." When I opened my eyes, the figure had vanished. I slammed the truck into gear and drove out of that clearing without looking back, the echo of those words ringing in my head. I never turned the CB back on that night or any other night since. When Sarah entered the estate sale, she wasn't looking for anything in particular. The old house smelled musty, filled with faded memories, and the scattered antiques seemed to whisper secrets of the past. As she wandered through the cluttered rooms, her eyes were drawn to an ornate mirror standing against the wall in a corner of the living room. The frame was carved from dark wood with intricate swirls and woven patterns around its edges, and the glass was slightly cloudy, giving it an air of timeless mystery. She hesitated before reaching for it. It was more expensive than anything else in the room. There was something about it that intrigued her. The elderly woman overseeing the sale noticed her interest and approached with a smile. Her voice was rough but warm. "It's been in the family for generations," she said. "I'm not sure it's worth much, but it has a strange history. Some say it shows more than just your reflection." Despite the warning, Sarah bought the mirror, thinking it was just an old, peculiar relic to add character to her new apartment. However, the woman's words lingered with her, and she found herself looking into the mirror more than she had anticipated. The first night after hanging it in her bedroom, Sarah stood before it, admiring how the frame glimmered in the dim light. Her reflection was clear, her long hair falling in soft waves, her blue eyes bright with curiosity. But as she looked deeper, she thought she saw something move in the glass, something that wasn't her. A flicker of movement in the corner of the mirror caught her attention. She blinked, and the figure was gone. Her heart skipped a beat, but she dismissed it as a trick of the light. Over the following days, strange things began to happen. Each time Sarah passed the mirror, it seemed to reflect more than just her image. She saw flashes of strange people, all dressed in clothing from different eras. Some smiled, while others looked worried, their eyes wide with fear or sadness. It wasn't just their faces. It was as if they were living, breathing figures within the glass. She learned that the mirror didn't show reflections in the traditional sense. It displayed moments in time, snapshots of lives that had come and gone. One evening, as Sarah stood before the mirror brushing her hair, a new figure appeared. It was a young man, no older than 20, his face pale and gaunt. His eyes were fixed on her, and although he didn't move, his gaze seemed to follow every movement she made. A chill ran down her spine as she turned to walk away, but before she could, a soft voice, almost a whisper, emerged from the mirror. "We won't go out tonight," it said. The words were clear to Sarah, distinct but unsettling. She froze, staring at the mirror. Her own reflection stared back, but the young man remained, his face locked in an expression of desperate urgency. Her pulse quickened. Was she hearing things? She glanced around the room, but there was no one else. The voice had come from the mirror. Confused and nervous, Sarah couldn't stop thinking about it the next day. She tried to rationalize it as nothing more than her imagination running wild. But later that night, as she left her apartment to meet friends for dinner, a strange feeling settled in her chest. She couldn't explain it, but something felt wrong. When she reached the corner, she heard a loud screech followed by the sound of tires skidding on pavement. Turning quickly, Sarah saw a car veering out of control, heading straight for her. Instinctively, she jumped back just as the vehicle crashed into the streetlight where she had been standing moments before. Her heart pounded in her ears as she realized how close she had come to disaster. When she returned to her apartment that night, Sarah stared at the mirror, her mind racing. The figure's warning now made sense. She had been saved not by chance, but by the mirror. It was as if the spirits trapped within were trying to protect her, guiding her through moments of danger. But why and what else did the mirror know? The following days brought more strange occurrences. The mirror continued to reflect visions of people known and unknown, occasionally speaking to her, warning her of imminent dangers, telling her when to be cautious or act quickly. One night, a woman with long, dark hair appeared, her face twisted in anguish. "There's someone following you," she said, her voice trembling. "Be careful who you trust." Sarah's heart skipped, but she couldn't fathom the warning. Who could be following her? The next day, Sarah encountered a man at a cafe, someone she had never seen before. He struck up a conversation, his words soft and friendly, and before long he asked for her number. She hesitated but gave it to him, feeling no immediate danger. But later that night, the realization hit her suddenly. The man had been the same one she had seen in the mirror earlier that week. He was the one who had warned her. As weeks passed, Sarah became more attuned to the mirror's cryptic messages. She learned to trust its warnings, but the burden was heavy. Each time she had a vision, She wondered if it was too late to change her course, too late to avoid the lurking danger. The mirror had become both a gift and a curse, a window to the unknown offering glimpses into the past, present, and future, but at a cost. The more she relied on the mirror, the more it consumed her, and she found herself unable to live without it. The whispers guided her, but the shadows it revealed grew darker with each passing day, and Sarah wondered if she was protecting herself or if the mirror was slowly drawing her into its world, one warning at a time. I had been waiting for a quiet moment to go out at night after a long work week. I decided to stop by the local bar to unwind. I was alone, not that it mattered, and found a seat by the window in the dim glow of streetlights casting shadows across the sidewalk. With a drink in hand, I tried to let go of the stress that had built up over the past few days, but something felt off. Started subtly, just a feeling that someone was watching me. I looked up from my drink and saw a man standing at the bar. He wasn't doing anything unusual, just sipping a beer and scanning the room. But when our eyes met, a chill ran down my spine. I quickly looked away, but the unease in my gut didn't subside. I tried to shake off the feeling and focused on my phone, scrolling mindlessly through social media, but the sensation persisted like a weight in my chest. Every few seconds, I'd glance up to find the man still at the bar, looking in my direction. The longer I sat there, the more convinced I became that he was watching me. I couldn't explain it, but something about him made me feel like I was being hunted. As the night wore on, I decided it was time to leave. The man was still there, now seated near the door, and I couldn't shake the feeling of being trapped. I paid my tab and stepped outside, feeling the cool air hit my skin. I walked quickly, hoping to get home without incident, but I noticed something odd, footsteps behind me. At first, I thought it was just someone walking in the same direction, but they were too deliberate, too close. I quickened my pace, and so did the footsteps. A glance over my shoulder confirmed my fear. The man from the bar was following me. My heart began to race as I turned down a side street, hoping to lose him in the maze of alleys and poorly lit paths. But no matter how fast I walked, his steps stayed in perfect sync with mine, like a shadow that wouldn't leave. Panic set in when I realized there was no escape from him. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, a primal instinct telling me I was in danger. I looked back again, and this time the man was too close. I could make out the details of his face. Pale skin and dark eyes that seemed to burn with an intensity that sent a shiver through me. He didn't look like someone casually walking. He looked hungry. I sped up, but now my feet felt heavy, as if the air around me was thickening. My mind raced with thoughts on what to do, where to go, but everything was fading as panic took hold. He reached me, my breathing accelerated, and my steps became more erratic. I didn't dare look back again, but I could feel him just behind me. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure he could hear it. When I reached my apartment building, I rushed inside, slamming the door behind me. My hands trembled as I locked all the bolts, my mind a mess of confusion and fear. I leaned against the door, trying to catch my breath. What had just happened? Why was that man following me? It didn't make sense. I walked to the window and peered through the blinds, half expecting to see him standing there, looking up, waiting, but the street was empty, the only sound the distant hum of traffic. For a moment, I allowed myself to breathe, thinking maybe I had overreacted, but then I saw something out of the corner of my eye. The man wasn't gone. He was across the street, standing under a streetlight in front of my building. His head slightly tilted as if he were looking directly at me. My pulse raced again. How had he gotten there so fast? My apartment was on the second floor, and I had made sure to lock the door securely. I couldn't fathom how he had followed me without my seeing him. I backed away from the window, trying to steady my breathing. I didn't know what to do, whether to call the police. Would they even believe me if I told them a stranger had followed me home and was now standing across the street? My mind raced as I tried to think of a plan, but everything felt so surreal, like I was trapped in a nightmare I couldn't wake from. After a few minutes, I gathered the courage to look through the blinds again. The man was still there, his gaze fixed on my apartment. His expression had changed. His lips were curved in a faint, unsettling smile. I couldn't tell if he was aware I was watching, but somehow, I knew he was waiting for something. I stumbled away from the window, my legs weak beneath me. I had to get out of there, but I didn't know where to go. I thought about the back door of the building, but I couldn't risk running into him again. I was trapped. There was no escape. The man remained across the street, motionless, watching, and I realized with horror that he wasn't just some random stranger. He knew where I lived, and I had no idea why. It wasn't until hours later, when I finally mustered the courage to call for help, that I discovered the truth. The police found no trace of the man, no sign of anyone in the area. As far as they were concerned, I was just another person with a crazy story. But I knew something they didn't. The man had been real, and he was still out there. The apartment had seemed like a dream. It was in a quiet neighborhood, close to everything I needed, and the rent was affordable. The landlord was friendly, and everything was in great condition. For the first few weeks, it felt like a fresh start. A place of my own where I could relax after a stressful day at work and finally enjoy some peace and solitude. But soon, small things started to feel off. At first, it was minor annoyances like finding the bathroom door slightly ajar when I was sure I had closed it. Then, I noticed the locks on my front door didn't seem to align perfectly, almost as if someone had tampered with them. It was subtle enough that I could attribute it to my imagination, but after a few more incidents, I began to feel like I was being watched. The first real sign that something was wrong came one afternoon when I returned home from work. I had been out for a few hours, but when I walked through the door, the bathroom light was on, and the scent of soap and shampoo lingered in the air. I was sure I had turned off the light before leaving. At first, I thought maybe I had simply forgotten, but the more I thought about it, the more I realized there was no way I could have left it on. I checked everything twice that morning. I hadn't. It only got worse as days passed. The bathroom wasn't the only room that seemed to show signs of another person's presence. My kitchen counter, which I always kept tidy, was occasionally cluttered with items I didn't recognize. Half-empty coffee cups, a lost spoon, and once, a small piece of paper with what looked like a shopping list in hurried, messy handwriting. I felt an overwhelming sense of unease as I tried to reason with myself, telling myself it might have been just a mistake. Maybe I had left the coffee cup there in a rush. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The oddities intensified when I discovered a hairbrush in my bathroom drawer that wasn't mine. It wasn't just any brush. The bristles were thick and long, and the handle was covered with what seemed to be a thin layer of dust, as if it had been placed there recently. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been in my space while I was out. I tried.